So in this week's module, we're going to be looking at Chapter 2, and we're talking specifically about policies and practices as they relate to programs. We'll investigate how legislation supports really, the practice and pedagogy of students with disabilities, including major national and state regulations, as well as some civil rights legislation. These important laws paved the way for inclusion of students with disabilities, and they outline the identification and assessment process that we'll dive into a little bit later in the term. In terms of what you want to focus on with your learning objectives, you definitely want to be able to identify the court cases that led to the enactment of Public Law 94-142. That's later called IDEA. You want to be able to summarize the key components of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act from 1975 to 2004, and then describe the legislative intent of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. We definitely want to focus on some key special education court cases. Of course, there have been thousands of court cases over the years since the special education laws were initiated, but there are 6 that you want to be able to really focus on that affect our day-to-day instruction of students with disabilities in the classroom, both general education and special education classrooms. The first is Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was in 1954, and this law is a civil rights law, not necessarily specific to special education, but it paved the way because what it did was it said that segregation by race is unconstitutional. As a result of that, this paved the way for changes in the educational practices of that time that also were segregating children by disability. The second case is called Park. This is the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children. Now, I know we've talked about how we don't say the word retarded because it's considered inappropriate and it's a slur. But at the time, this is actually how the law was written. So, of course, today we use the language intellectual disability, but most of us just refer to this particular legislation as Park versus Pennsylvania. This case happened in 1972, and what this said was that states have to guarantee a free public education to all children who have intellectual disabilities ages 6 to 21 and younger if the school districts provide services to preschool-age children without disabilities. So currently our services for school ages 6 to 21, but if a district has a preschool for children without disabilities, then they also have to provide those same early childhood services for children with intellectual disabilities. The third case is Board of Education addressed Hendrick Hudson Central School District versus Rowley. We often just call this the Rowley case. This was in 1982. This was the first U.S. Supreme Court interpretation of our IDEA law, which is PL 94-142, that determined what constitutes appropriate education. When we talk about how we have to have a free, appropriate public education, this law or this legislation said this is what appropriate means. And in this situation, it was a child with a hearing impairment. Appropriate was found to mean reasonable, but not necessarily optimal accommodations. So I encourage you to go and Google the Rowley case and see specifically what it was about a student who had deafness and whether or not the school was required to provide an interpreter. The fourth case is Daniel R.R. versus the State Board of Education. This was in 1989, and what it did was it established the least restrictive environment was based on whether a student can make satisfactory progress in the general curriculum and if the student has been integrated to the maximum extent possible. So this really pushed on our idea of least restrictive environment. Our fifth case is Oberti versus Board of Education of the Borough of Clementon School District. This was in 1992. And what this said was that placement in the general education classroom with the support of aids and services must be offered to a student before considering a more restrictive placement. So if we've got a student with disabilities in the general education classroom and we say, you know what, he needs to go back to the resource room or she needs to go to a self-contained classroom, before you can do that, you have to provide additional aids and support in that general setting. So placement outside the general education classroom in order to meet the student's needs has to be justified. The last case, of course there are many, but the last case that I want you to be able to focus on and be able to talk about is the Cedar Rapids Community School District versus Garrett F. This was in 1999. And what this legislation did was it expanded and clarified the concept for related services to include intensive and continuous health care services that are necessary for students to attend school that are not provided by a physician. So these are students who are sometimes termed medically fragile, or students who have significant medical needs, that we still as a school district have to provide those intensive healthcare services in order for the students to attend school. So those are 6 cases that you need to know, but now we're going to shift and focus on actual legislation or laws. So looking at this key special education legislation, we're going to start with Public Law 94-142, or PL 94-142. This was originally named the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975. Of course, as you read in last week's chapter, we don't use handicap to refer to people. Those are different situations. So the law has actually changed its name since then, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this law guaranteed 6 components, or 6 things that must happen for students with disabilities who require special education services. One is a free, appropriate public education. We often, as teachers, call this FAPE. We actually just refer to it as that. And FAPE guarantees that all students, regardless of the severity of their disability, will receive a public education that is free and appropriate. And we follow that zero reject philosophy. And you'll learn more about that in your text. The second component is least restrictive environment. And in the classroom, we often just call it LRE. So when you're at a meeting for an IEP, they'll talk about what's the LRE for the student. In the LRE, this component means that children with disabilities should be educated to the maximum extent possible with their classmates who don't have disabilities. So we always want to err on the side of inclusion, and then if we need to move to a more restrictive placement, we can. But we start with the goal of maximum inclusion in the least restrictive environment. The third component is the Individualized Education Program, or IEP. And this means an educational plan that's designed to meet the individual needs of children who have disabilities that impact their educational performance. The IEP is going to be discussed later in the chapter, and we'll actually do some more in-depth work on IEPs later in the semester. But just to be really clear, the Individualized Education Program, that IEP, the key is that it's individualized. We don't have universal plans for anyone, but the individualized plans based on an individual student's needs. The next component is procedural due process, and these are safeguards that are provided to help the students and the families. They include things like confidentiality of records, the parents' rights for access, so they can access the students' records, having the right to have an independent evaluation, independent from the school if you need to, and then the parents' legal right to legal counsel, and having an impartial hearing regarding any disagreements that come up when it comes to how do we educate the student or what are we putting into the program. The fifth component is a non-discriminatory assessment, and we'll talk about this also later in the term when we really look more at assessment. But prior to placement or a student receiving special education services, the child needs to be evaluated by a multidisciplinary team in all areas suspected of disability. And when we do those evaluations, we have to use tests and assessments that aren't racially, culturally, or linguistically biased. The last component is parental participation. In this, parents are considered equal partners. So they have just as many rights and voice, just as much voice as the administrators, the teachers, the speech-language pathologists, anyone else that participates on that team. And because they're equal partners, they can participate fully in the decision-making process for their child's education. We're also going to look at some key civil rights legislation. We're going to start with the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, this act employs a broader definition of eligibility than IDEA, and it states that no individual can be excluded solely because of their disability from participating in any program or activity that receives federal funding, and this includes schools. Schools might be required to develop plans to meet the needs of those students who require accommodations. Often students who have a disability that doesn't severely impact their learning won't qualify for an IEP, but they may still need accommodations, and that's where Section 504 comes in. If you've heard of 504 plans for students. We'll take a look at the Americans with Disabilities Act, sometimes called ADA, or formally PL 101-336. This was passed in 1990, and this act was designed to eliminate discrimination against people with disabilities in both the public and private sectors. What it did was expand definitions of eligibility to include people with AIDS, substance abuse issues, or any type of impairment that limits a major life activity. Employers, mass transit systems, companies that provide products and services, all of these must make what are called reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. And then in 2008, there was the Americans with Disabilities Act amendments, PL 110-325. This was a reauthorization of the ADA, and it's most commonly called the ADAA. It became effective in January 2009, and it actually broadened the interpretation of disability to include additional life activities like reading, concentration, thinking, or body functions like immune system or neurological functioning. I want you to really focus on being able to identify ways in which you can see how these cases and this legislation affect how we teach in the classroom every day.